All right, go ahead, Jay.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our meeting of the American Civil Defense Association. We are a private nonprofit organization devoted to helping people prepare themselves for any man-made or natural disaster. Hopefully, you're all familiar with our website, and you go there often. And there's a lot of really good information there. Tonight we're covering, well, and me, I'm Jay Wimpy. I'm the current president of the American Civil Defense Association, and we rotate that assignment periodically, but it's I've had it for the last few years, and certainly is nice to work with everyone and to help everyone, well, answer all the questions and interface with a lot of very interesting people with a lot of very interesting questions. So we're happy to have you here tonight. We are covering the TACDA Academy Chapter 2, which deals with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons effects, and hopefully how to protect yourselves from those weapons. Everyone knows that nuclear weapons are incredibly powerful. They can release a lot of energy very quickly. You know, it's well, you just can't really comprehend, releasing that much energy so quickly. But they deal with megatons, as in millions of tons of TNT. TNT is a relatively standard explosive. It's used very commonly in warheads for bombs and missiles, and so it's kind of a standard explosive. It's probably one of the more popular explosives because it's relatively inexpensive and does a good job, behaves very reliably, and so that's what they use. So anyway, a lot of the weapons now can be maybe a half a megaton, and it was decided, at least by the US military a long time ago, that it was actually better to have more smaller warheads than have a few big warheads, and so that's the way they're doing it. So we believe that there are some in our some of our enemies may possess warheads that are up to 50 to 100 megatons in with power. That tends to make a very big explosion, but the explosive effects of that weapon decay with the cube of the distance, and so it falls off relatively quickly. You can do a lot more damage with smaller warheads, so we'll probably, well, I'm thinking we'll probably see smaller warheads, perhaps in less than 1 million tons of TNT energy, and that energy is released so quickly in the microsecond range, and that's some of the what that adds to the explosive power and effect. Anyway, when we're thinking about nuclear weapons, we have to protect ourselves. Well, there's the heat effect. It's like having a little ball of the sun when a nuclear weapon goes off. If you're in line of sight, say within 10 miles of that weapon, you can actually get severely burned. The atmosphere doesn't really absorb the heat flux coming from those weapons. It tends to be somewhat transparent, and so you can get burned. We learn a lot from the people who survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and their clothing could actually protect them substantially from that initial heat flux. But if they had exposed skin, then they received second and third degree burns almost immediately. A conventional nuclear weapon delivered by a intercontinental ballistic missile actually re-enters the atmosphere in what they call a re-entry vehicle, but it's built to where it can re-enter the atmosphere and survive coming into the atmosphere at very high velocities. But it will actually look like a shooting star, and these shooting stars can actually they're bright enough to where they can be seen during the daytime. So I guess if you are ever out and about and you happen to see a something like a shooting star in the middle of the day, it's probably advisable to turn your head, close your eyes, and cover your cover whatever body parts you can, and do the old duck and cover type thing that they used to preach in order to protect yourself from that initial heat flux. And I'm going through this relatively quickly because we do have a lot of information to go over tonight, and so there's a lot more information in the TACDA Academy. I'm somewhat summarizing so we can move a little bit faster, but I'll try to hit the high points for you. But anyway, there's the thermal heat flux, and then and it can cause a fair amount of burns. And we talked about evasive actions. That's actually just hiding. If you see a flash, or if you see that reentry vehicle coming down like a shooting star in the middle of the day, then it's good to just try and duck behind anything you can, and cover up as best you can. The old duck and cover. And let me see. That's called evasive actions. There's also a blast effect. That usually takes a little bit to get there. It's almost immediate if you're within the first mile or so. But after that, the blast effect only travels at maybe a few hundred miles an hour, and so there could actually be, it covers, it can go almost the speed of sound, but you might have a few seconds to actually get behind something. A substantial wall is good, and or get away from windows. The windows will tend to shatter and perhaps lacerate you as they're breaking and moving. But you'll see a heavy overpressure. A 5-pound overpressure can actually kill a human, and those bombs can actually produce a 5-pound overpressure out to a few miles from where they are. But again, it's good to get behind something substantial. And there's usually the blast. The blast goes out, and then as the mushroom cloud develops and goes up, there's actually a substantial wind coming back in. And you've probably all seen some of the old video clips of some of the open air testing that was done in Nevada, where they set up, whole forests and houses and all that kind of stuff that just fly apart, as the blast wave hits them, or they bend this way, and then as the mushroom clouds lift, the blast, or a heavy wind, will come back the other way. So it is advisable to have some fairly substantial structure around you to help protect you from flying debris and the overpressure itself. There's also the EMP effect, and we're used to talking about an EMP weapon, which is a nuclear weapon that is detonated high above the atmosphere, and that actually spreads the EMP effect over a very wide area. There is, however, a localized EMP effect that with a nuclear weapon exploding close to the ground, basically you're getting essentially the same thing that goes out to maybe 20-30 miles from that. Again, basically line of sight from the open, from that weapon. The militaries have also learned that it's good to that a nuclear weapon can actually do more damage if it is detonated above the ground, maybe a few thousand feet above the ground, instead of right on the ground. For hardened targets like missile silos, or perhaps runways, aircraft runways, you will see some ground bursts and a fairly heavy amount of radiation. But if you're trying to destroy a city, a rather wide, relatively soft target, then it's usually what they call an air burst. And so that spreads the destruction much further than a ground burst. And then there's the dynamic effect. And then as most people, a lot of people are very concerned about the radiation effect, and especially with the ground burst, there is a lot of material that's sucked up into that nuclear fireball, and it becomes relatively well, it makes a lot of material relatively highly radioactive, and then that material can actually be deposited maybe 100,000 feet in the air and then gradually fall out. And so based on the prevailing winds, the fallout from that weapon can actually be spread downrange up to hundreds of miles. And normally those particles are relatively big. The material is actually the material is spread, or excuse me, the material is goes up in the fireball, is usually melted, and then those little liquid droplets of melted matter will tend to agglomerate, as in become bigger particles, and then it is deposited, and or it's deposited downrange. Heavier particles fall out first, lighter particles fall out later, but anywhere from anywhere from ground zero down to 100 miles, can have a fairly substantial amount of fallout and radiation from that. There is a 710 rule, and I was going to try to share my screen here and show you a little bit about how that how the radiation decays. It decays actually very quickly, which is nice. And here we go. Oops. Let's see, can we see that? Anyway, this is a radiation chart in nuclear war survival skills. Again, you can get a hard copy from the American Civil Defense Association, or you can download a copy for free. But you see that there is 1 hour after, say if you have 1,000 Roentgens per hour of radiation from the fallout, then in roughly 7 hours, that will it will fall to roughly, roughly 1/10 of the amount of radiation. 7 hours, and so it's reducing 80%, and then it goes down to well, that's 7 hours, and then if you 7 times 7, which is 49 hours, or roughly 2 days, it falls another 90%, and then after 2 weeks, it goes down another 90%. But you have to 7 times the 2 days up to 14 days, and then it falls another 90%. So within 2 weeks, the radiation has fallen to 1/1000th of what it is. So it's a relatively intense radiation for a relatively short period of time. So if you have a shelter where you can stay for a month or two, then things might be in pretty good shape. The amount of radiation is well, you can see levels as high as say 3,000 Roentgens per hour, and you can only handle about 300 Roentgens per hour or Roentgens total exposure before you get sick. And if it's more like 600 Roentgens that you receive, then most people will die at that amount. So and if you do the calculations, at 3,000 Roentgens per hour, and if 600 is bad, then it's just a fifth of an hour, basically 10 or 11 minutes, and you receive a lethal dose of radiation. You don't die immediately, but you will die over the next few weeks if you receive that much radiation. Basically, your cells can't function anymore. The DNA has been obliterated. The cells can't reproduce, and so the tissues end up, or the cells end up dying, and your tissue ends up falling apart, and you die of various causes, usually internal bleeding if you get too much radiation. And that's the next thing that I wanted to talk about. There are many ways that we can shield ourselves from that fallout. You can think of the fallout being something like light that, let me see, I thought there was another, I guess not. Anyway, there is a bunch of particles, and they're emitting light, but the light, again, decays with the cube of the distance from that light, because it's shining out in all directions. And therefore, if we can put some distance between us and the radiation, as in if you can be in the middle of a great big building that keeps that radioactive dust outside, or if you can be in the middle floor of a very tall building, there's fallout that's deposited on the roof, and some that's deposited on the ground, but the distance helps you. And then we've already talked about how the time helps you, as in if you can just stay hidden for a relatively short period of time, maybe a month or two, then the radiation will substantially decay. And the other thing you can do is put mass between you and there we go. There's this chart here where this shows halving thickness, as in the radiation, and gamma radiation is very penetrating. And so, we think of lead as being, somewhat impenetrable from radiation, but in reality, every atom is largely open space. There's most of the mass is in the nucleus, a little bit of the mass is in the electron shells around that, but there's a lot of open space in all matter here on Earth, and therefore some of the radiation gets through. But say if we take either earth or concrete or something like that, everything has a halving thickness, which means like 1 inch of lead will cut the radiation by 50% or cut it in half. Lead's rather expensive, hard to come by, hard to work with, and therefore we tend to look for dirt, because dirt is much cheaper. And so if you can say the halving thickness with earth is about 5 inches. So if we have 5 inches of dirt between us and that radiation, it can cut that in half. And if we add another 5 inches of dirt, then we can cut it in half again, or it's 1/4, or another 5 inches, we cut it in half again, it's 1/8, or 1/16, or 1/32. So, if you add a couple of feet of dirt between you and that radiation, as in an underground shelter, then we can protect ourselves from that, from the radiation rather effectively. And
Excuse
while
me, Jay,
you're,
just so you know, the screen is not showing.
oh, it's not. Oh, I
No,
thought I was.
unfortunately. Yeah,
Oh,
unfortunately,
shoot.
it's not showing.
Oh, shoot.
Just so you know.
Okay. Darn, I thought I did the share screen, and I thought I was ready. Sorry about that. Let me I'll try the share screen again, and then choose this and then share. So can you see that now?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought you were seeing what I was seeing. I'm sorry. Anyway, this diagram, which is in nuclear war survival skills, it shows you the halving thicknesses of what of some things. Concrete tends to be about 4 inches. Earth is about 5 inches, packed earth, and if you had a bunch of wood, I guess it's more like 36 inches is a halving thickness. It's not nearly as dense as earth is, and so it needs much more, I guess, width, I guess, to cut that radiation in half. But that's our best protection from a from radiation, I guess, is just being able to perhaps build an underground shelter that's going to give us some protection from the blast effects, heat effects, and the radiation effects. Now, this is gamma radiation, and there's also there is alpha and beta radiation that comes from that radioactive fallout. However, the alpha radiation is a rather big particle. It's a helium nucleus, and it doesn't penetrate very far. And in fact, they say your clothing can protect you from alpha radiation. Beta is basically a free electron, and so it can penetrate through your clothing, but not very far into your skin. In fact, just an eighth of an inch of aluminum can actually protect you from beta. And so those aren't nearly as big of a concern unless we ingest them. And so basically we have to be careful with not ingesting anything that's been contaminated with nuclear fallout, because that alpha and beta radiation, even though it can't hurt us much, if it's on the outside of our body, they can do a fair amount of damage if it's on the inside of the body. So we need to be very careful with that. And if something has been exposed to radiation, as in you have a sealed can of beans or something of that nature, if it's been exposed to radiation, it's fine. The gamma radiation can't hurt it, and such. It tends to kill living things, but the proteins would largely be intact and such. And so we can still eat the contents of a can of beans. We just don't want to get ingest any of that material. Again, I'll talk about the radiation penalty chart. If you well, again, this is in the TACDA Academy, and I'm not going to switch over to that, but they say if accumulated exposure in 1 week, if you get 150 Rankins, then you will not be there should be no medical care needed. And at 250, they say some may need medical care, few if any deaths. 450, they say most need medical care, 50% may die. And then at 600 Rankins, they say most people will die. And so anyway, and then they have some exposure, say 30 miles downwind. If you're out in the open and there is a 3,450 Rankins per hour, if you are in a shelter that has a protection factor of 15, you'll get 230 Rankins overall in the first month. If you're in if you have a protection factor of 40, as in you get 1/40th of the radiation inside the shelter as you would on the outside, then you would only receive 86 Rankins, and you would survive with no particular you shouldn't have very many problems there. So anyway, we just have to it's good to have some radiation detection equipment. There are dosimeters and radiation detectors on the open market, and you can actually let's see, I'm trying to find the other section here, make sure I don't forget anything. But anyway, so that's what we need to do, well, with a nuclear weapon, or to protect ourselves from nuclear weapons. If you have a house that has a basement, that's an excellent place to start. You can actually stack some of your food storage, or if you have to use dirt, you can stack dirt, a little bit of dirt on top of the a shelter that was built in the basement. You're basically covered from the sides all the way around. So if you provide a little bit of mass over the top of you and get in a makeshift shelter there, and there's lots of this information in the in nuclear war survival skills. In fact, I can go ahead and talk about well, this shows a little bit about the if how high the mushroom clouds will go. this shows, you know, if in a what they would say a standard nuclear attack, you know, this is how much radiation you'd expect based on your section or based on your area of the country. So those are based on nuclear targets. You can see in Montana and North Dakota, all those big black areas. Those are our nuclear missile sites, and so they would receive some very heavy, a very heavy concentration of nuclear weapons detonations, and a very heavy dose of radiation. There are some in Wyoming as well. We have some targets here around northern Utah, and then they have the submarine bases in up in the Seattle area and in Bangor, Maine. So those would receive a fair amount of attention as well. So this well, again, this talks a little bit about how you can protect yourself from radiation, and they did a little, what would you say? They did an exercise where they got a couple of college girls together, and with 24 hours notice, they could build themselves a fairly effective fallout shelter. And this is basically it. You dig a trench. It's good to shore the sides of the trench if possible, depends on how solid your soil is. But then you lay some timbers over the top of that trench, and then you cover the trench with soil, and that provides you fairly good protection from fallout. So I would highly recommend you getting the Nuclear War Survival Skills book, going over the early part of that, and then using that book to kind of guide your preparation efforts. So anyway, I was gonna, any questions before we leave the nuclear side? I know I went over this relatively quickly, but we could talk about biological and chemical weapons, I guess. That's where I'm headed. If anyone, well, if I don't have any questions. If not, we'll, let me see. Oh, sorry.
Hi there, Jake. It's
Yes.
Eleanor.
Hello, Eleanor.
I have a question. Hi. If you have like solar generators, right, that have those lithium iron phosphate batteries, will they explode like in this type of nuclear blast, you know, or thermonuclear blast, or
No,
like?
I wouldn't say not necessarily. You know, those batteries are susceptible to that if the batteries are sealed, and if they are exposed to oxygen, then that's when they, you know, light on fire and explode and such. So I wouldn't expect that they would have problems if they can be you know, in a protected area. And I don't think the EMP will necessarily break the or, you know, it's not going to cause them to explode under most circumstances. That would be my guess. If they
Okay.
can just receive a little bit of protection from a lot of physical damage.
Right, and then just put them in some sort of Faraday bag or cage of some sort to protect them further.
That's ideal. And you'll find those underground shelters that are actually very good at you know, they soak up a lot of EMP, and so that tends to be good. But if you can find a metal case to put those in, that would be a very good thing to do, and that way they'll function afterwards, and having a little bit of power after you know, in such a situation would be really handy.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, going on to biological weapons. Biological weapons do exist. We've had some people defect out of the Soviet biological weapons program, and that person indicated that the Soviets have, well, this is the old Soviet Union, but the weapons still exist in Russia, they have at least a dozen different organisms that are that have been developed, and they're in long-term storage, and they could be deployed at essentially any time to be used. And in fact, some biological weapons wouldn't even have to have a delivery system except for a human being. A person, say, if we just use smallpox as an example, an individual could be infected with smallpox. He would have 7 to 10 days before he became symptomatic, and all he would have to do is travel to the United States and travel from airport to airport, and cough a little bit, breathe on people a little bit, or whatever, or maybe go to the Super Bowl and walk up and down the hallways, and that person would he would spread smallpox, which is explosively contagious, and the natural forms of smallpox are maybe 20 to 30% lethal, and we would have a very serious biological attack on our hands. The government has done exercises on this. They call it the dark winter exercises, where they say, okay, what if somebody did that? They're infected with smallpox. They visit 4 or 5 major cities in the United States, and then those people who are infected, they go infect other people or whatever. And so basically they say within a month or so, the healthcare system in the United States is overwhelmed, and a lot of people die. Many people would recover yet, but it would be a very serious pandemic for quite some time. They estimate that it would take about 6 months for the virus to work its way through the population, killing, like I say, up to 30% of the people, and everything would stop. And really, the only way that we can protect ourselves from a situation like that is to, if we do ever hear of something like that, is a self-imposed reverse quarantine. That is where healthy people keep themselves away from the sick people, or you just don't go out in public for a while. So it's good to have all your food and water stored to where you can actually do a self-imposed reverse quarantine, where you keep yourselves away from everybody else in society while that virus makes its way through the population, killing many, and eventually, people would either die or recover, but the virus would run out of hosts, and eventually, the virus would stop. But it would take 6 months to a year for that to happen. So, and another way, I guess, there's all sorts of ways that you could deploy a biological weapon, and they have bioweapons don't really, they're the scariest, I would say. They spread, and people are basically little incubators for whatever virus or organism that they're trying to spread, if you do spread a biological weapon. And so they there's a lot of free energy in the body, and we are incubators for all that virus, and we spread it to other people. So one or two particles of a biological agent in the lung of one person can actually start a pandemic. That's the power of a biological weapon. So there's something to be really reckoned with, and the best way is possibly having a respirator, some suits or whatever to protect yourselves, and just be real attuned, or be aware of what's going on. And if there is, if it looks like another pandemic is starting, just be prepared to remove yourself from society and from contact with other people outside your family for an extended period of time. Like I said, there's many biological weapons that are ready to go. They're probably developing more in China right now, but the Soviet Union did this many, many years ago. and those weapons still exist as far as we know. Chemical weapons, on the other hand, are like tactical weapons. You know, they're used in relatively small areas, and and they by their nature they have to be reactive, and so they don't last long in the environment. Usually sunshine will deactivate most chemical weapons. So the chemical weapons would normally have to be deployed in a local area for a short period of time. That would be like the nerve agents that we're talking about. They can survive for perhaps a few hours in open sunshine, but they would be deactivated relatively quickly. And there, say with nerve agents, there are some antidotes that the military has deployed, but in trying to protect yourself, you just have to be aware and try and have a place where you can go sleep where you'd be somewhat protected. In the Journal of Civil Defense a couple of issues ago, I wrote an article about a biological filter that can be built for relatively modest means or modest amount of money, that just uses the filter cartridges for the military's gas masks, and you can put several of those together and couple them with a pump, and so you could be inside your house or maybe a shelter of some kind, and take turns pumping the air into your sheltered space and stay there for a while if you thought that a chemical or a biological attack was imminent in that respect. There are also mustard agents. They would persist in the atmosphere a little bit longer. They're kind of an oily substance that could be spread on leaves and foliage and things of that nature. And as you walk through, if you could be exposed to the mustard agents, they tend to cause kind of chemical burns, and they're a horrible mutagen. So basically, they cause a lot of bad things to happen to your body. There is a reason that the United States signed treaties not to develop and deploy biological and chemical agents, and but while the old Soviet Union was signing the treaties, they had tens of thousands of people working on developing biological weapons, and they were successful largely based on the testimony of people who have been in that that were part of that program, who later defected to the United States. So anyway, overall, if you can build a sheltered space somewhere in your home or close by, and make it possible to filter the air coming into that space, that would be largely protective. And then having some bunny suits and gloves and tape and respirators, means that you could possibly go out in a situation like that and be protected. The military has MOP suits that are, the heavy rubber suits, and again, they have the respirators and such, and it's meant to protect them from chemical and biological agents when they're out doing their military things. For most people, it's better just to hide in a section, and actually, it's really bad. You just have to be aware of what might happen, and understand that, I guess, they can't deploy enough chemical weapons to really have a serious effect on the population overall, because they are tactical weapons. They have to be deployed in a relatively small area, and maybe a few square miles, and the people in that area are definitely at risk, but they can't cover the whole country. There's just not enough chemical agents to do that. We had an experience here in Utah many decades ago. They were doing some open air testing on chemical agents, some of the VX nerve agents at the Utah Test and Training Range. Supposedly they were deploying or they were trying chemical weapons some of these chemical weapons, and either the valve didn't shut off or the pilot forgot to shut them off or whatever, and they happened to kill 3,000 sheep that were in a valley that was next to the Utah Test and Training Range. So there were, like I said, they killed roughly 3,000 sheep, and luckily, as from what I remember, there were no human fatalities. It was just the sheep out there that were exposed to it, and that ended up dying from the exposure. So that's kind of the situation that we're in. Hopefully, the major powers wouldn't go that far to deploy chemical and biological agents, but the agents do exist, and we should be somewhat prepared. And I think the best we just is being aware, watching, and then trying to have a plan, I guess, if you do know that or if you suspect that either a biological or a chemical agent was being deployed. There have been biological agents used recently, say in Syria, and that against the Kurds. I believe those were the nerve agents, and those can actually be absorbed through the skin as well as respiration. So you need, again, that's where the bunny suits and the gloves and boots and respirators come into play if you have to operate in an environment where you know that there are chemical or biological agents being used. Hopefully that doesn't happen, and many countries have actually signed treaties that said that they won't do that, but the agents do exist, and they have been used on real people in the last decade, as far as we know. So we just have to be aware of that. Any questions on chemical biological agents? That's let me see. Looking through anyway. A lot of people underestimate biologicals after COVID. Yeah, that may be the case. We went through COVID. COVID was actually a relatively mild virus. It seemed like it was more potent initially. I read an interesting book just recently called oh my goodness. It was called the Great Flu, was it? Anyway, the Great Influenza by John Barry, I believe. Anyway, that talked about how viruses tend to start. They can be very virulent initially, maybe killing most of their hosts, and as it goes on, they become usually a little bit more contagious and a little less virulent as time goes on. He actually postulated that the Spanish flu that killed so many people back in the early 1900s, just after the First World War, there was a pandemic noticed, or at least an epidemic noticed by a kind of a frontier doctor in Kansas at that time, and he a couple of the people from that area were drafted and went to an army base in somewhere on the East Coast, and that's kind of where they first noticed the pandemic. And it was really unfortunate that even after they noticed the pandemic of the Spanish influenza had started, the military kind of, you know, they had their orders, so they kept shipping people from camp to camp and to fort, and so they largely spread the disease in the United States. And then perhaps it was our soldiers that ended up transporting that to Europe as well, where, you know, and they estimate perhaps as many as 20 million people died, but they weren't keeping very good records back then, and so that was kind of kind of a good lesson as to how, you know, perhaps a natural virus behaves, but even a man-made virus, you know, could act somewhat the same, where they do mutate, and the COVID was built to mutate. It was a single-strand virus, a lot like a cold virus, and so it was very unstable, and they do mutate as they go along. So, but like I said, the thing to do is to be aware. You know, if there's some unknown virus that's killing people in some part of the world, you know, it's good to remember that there's people flying all over the world to all these different places, and that someone could easily bring it back to your city, and so you have to be just aware that that's happening, and make arrangements and be prepared to isolate yourself from society if something like that ever happens. In actuality. Any other questions? Let me see. We've got what types of filtration systems are fallout shelter. I noticed. You know, there is the Swiss-made the Andair air filtration systems that they're made to do this. They're fairly expensive, but they can be purchased here in the United States. That's what I have for my primary shelter. But other than that, if you read the article a couple of issues ago in the Journal of Civil Defense, they have you can use just the Chembio filters, the regular military respirator cartridges, the 40 millimeter respirator cartridges. Put some of those in parallel and get enough air for your shelter. And we could, you know, this might I'd have to, I don't have all the numbers in my head right now, but you need maybe a few hundred cubic feet per person per hour in order to ventilate a shelter, and it's mainly dependent on the number of people in the shelter because they're producing CO2, and there's ways to minimize that. If you have some CO2 absorbent material, you actually in an enclosed space, you tend to die of CO2 poisoning before you die of lack of oxygen. And so if you have a CO2 absorber, you can actually go a little bit longer in a shelter. But that's kind of what I remember, maybe 100, 200 cubic feet per hour of fresh air or filtered air into your shelter, based on the number of people. And let me see, I do have that chart. It's not prepared, but maybe we can put that on the website. Any other questions at this point?
This is Jim here from Pennsylvania. I just want to make a comment. You mentioned about Switzerland. I had friends from Switzerland, and the last time that I visited, I went there maybe 3 or 4 times, and at the home that I was in, they took me downstairs for something, and they opened this one room, and it was completely like thick concrete walls, and they had weapons in there, and I was curious about it, so I asked them, and I said, "What, why do you have this?" And they said that the government actually encourages people to have them. I think they have to build them because many of their homes are really built very solidly, but they have weapons and masks and everything. And so I think the government there really takes this stuff a lot more seriously than we do.
Oh, they do. They actually mandate that you have a shelter in each new house that is built, and they provide sheltering, which does have chemical biological filtration for everyone. Well, like 120% of the people in their country. Back in the 80s, they were spending about $30 per person per year to do that, and in the last few years, they had a referendum as to whether or not they keep going on the civil defense program, and the population voted to continue with the civil defense program. And they also issue a semi-automatic rifle to everybody in their country, and they have regular shooting practices there, and they store the weapon and ammunition at home, and and basically they are very well defended, and even uh, a a military of vastly superior numbers would have a very hard time um, affecting the population because they're all armed, and they all have a basically a blast shelter that and and a nuclear fallout shelter that they can go to. And a lot of the public shelters under all their um, soccer fields, can handle thousands of people, and they have sheltered hospitals underneath their regular hospitals, and they are prepared to survive in about any event. I see a question. What is the CO2 absorber? I can do a little bit more research. Maybe we can get that out on the web as well. But there are some, well, basically it's kind of an acid absorber, but there are some materials that absorb CO2. So if you filtered your air through that, it would tend to let the oxygen through and absorb the CO2, and so you could actually filter your oh, you could recycle a lot of the oxygen that's in your shelter space and get rid of the CO2. Uh, and we could put the CO2 penalty chart. Basically, there's a formula for how many cubic feet of open space you have in your shelter and the number of people, and it can tell you how many hours you can go without without ventilating the shelter. Tells you how long you can stay in there. Even, well, I know the FEMA people, they, if there's a say an overturned tanker well, of some bad chemical, they might tell you to shelter inside. I think a lot of times they're you can actually keep the little bubble of air inside your car, or inside your car or your house, I guess, and survive for a little while there's perhaps a cloud that comes over of this of whatever bad chemical it is, and you can actually survive in your house. And they tell you to go in say an interior room that doesn't have windows, and try and put a wet towel under the door, and duct tape the um, the seams on the door and such, and survive there for a while. But they really should provide the information, and maybe that would be a good article to have about how long you can stay in a particular sized room with so many people, and before you have to come out and um, risk breathing the air. But you can only stay in there for so long, and that is a finite number. Any other comments? If not, it's certainly been nice. I hope this has been useful for you. Again, if you want to learn more on these subjects, there's a lot of information in the past issues of the Journal of Civil Defense, which you can subscribe to for free. You just go to TACDA.org, and there's the other publications that we have, as in the TACDA chapter lectures, and the Nuclear War Survival Skills book, which we highly recommend. And you can become very familiar with these subjects, and um, know how to protect yourself. And that, for the most part, that's the most important thing, is that you know what to do in any in any in any situation that will help you survive.
Excuse me, Jay, can you just give them a brief description of your recent blog post about the shelter that you just constructed? I think people would find that of interest.
Okay. Yeah, if you the TACDA does have a blog, and you know, we don't have room for all the articles or all the information that we have in the Journal of Civil Defense. So sometimes we include something in the blog, but as a concept, I recently built what you would maybe consider a root cellar for my wife. We do store food in there, but basically it's a wooden structure. It has a wooden foundation, and that consists of 4 by 12 planks that are covered in 6 mil plastic to keep them from getting wet and rotting, and then uh, 4 by 12 planks about 20 feet long, and then some 8 by 8 vertical posts that are put on those planks, and then some 8 by 12 beams that go on top of those posts, creating a room that is 8 foot wide and 20 feet long, and with 4 by 12 planks again on top of that structure, and then 2 by 12 planks or boards going on the sides, you know, to keep the dirt out. The structure was put together with lag bolts, and then covered with plastic in order to protect it. The posts were also covered in plastic, the part that is below the earth line, so that any no wood is exposed directly to the earth. It's all covered with the 6 mil plastic, and then there's a little door structure. We have an environmental door, and then a metal door coming out on a 4 foot wide and 8 foot long entryway. But you can enter the structure standing up and just walk in, then make a 90-degree turn, and you're into the rest of the shelter. We put roughly 3 foot of dirt on top of that structure, and it stays very cool. It didn't freeze this last winter, which was nice, you know, so you can keep bottled materials in there that are mostly water. And now, even though, you know, in our 70-degree days, we're still in the 38 to 40-degree range inside that cellar. So it makes a pretty good root cellar, as well as food storage. And then in a pinch, it's a very good fallout shelter as well. So you can look at the plans. There's a few pictures there, and it's just a concept. You can actually build one much smaller than that would probably be fairly effective as a fallout shelter, and it would function pretty good as a tornado shelter as well. So, you know, for those of you who live in the parts of the country where you have tornadoes, it can handle most anything except for a flood. And we may we may be in for a flood. We've had got a lot of snow up in the mountains today, and we're kind of struggling with that. Anyway, we'll let everybody go for today. We're certainly happy that you showed up. It looks like we've had a pretty good crowd here. We're bumping up against our limit of 100 people, and so we certainly appreciate your attendance. And if you let others know, and you know, go subscribe to the Journal of Civil Defense. The electronic version is free, and or we wouldn't be offended if you actually subscribe to the print version, which does cost money. And we are a 501c3 charity, and so we always would appreciate any financial support that you can provide for us. We kind of operate on a shoestring, and we are always grateful for any help that you can give us. So thank you, and we hope to see you next month, and hope that you can make a little bit of progress on getting better prepared.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you. Appreciate it all. And y'all have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jay.
Great job, Jay.
Thank you. Okay, we'll talk to y'all later.
Mom, I need